podcast where we try to take the issues of the day and put them in a little bit of a larger historical or theoretical context. This is Samantha Hancox-Lee once again. No Jason this time, but I am very excited to have on for the first time our guest, Toby Buckle, the host of the Political Philosophy podcast and author of several pieces for Liberal Currents. What I believe you called your Trump trilogy. Trying to explain a little bit more about how we got into the situation that we're in today. So yeah, Toby, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Samantha. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I guess to set the stage a little bit, I mean, this is a topic we've talked about before on neoliberalism, but what just happened? I want to start with the numbers, actually, because I think it's important to focus on some of these numbers. In the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton got about, I'm just rounding here, 66 million votes. Trump gets 63 million votes, but because of certain vagaries of the Electoral College, he becomes president anyways. In 2020, Biden gets 81 million votes and Trump 74 million votes. And then in 2024, Kamala Harris gets 75 million votes and Donald Trump gets 77 million votes. So he wins, as we say, fair and square. But what these numbers sort of reflect is that Donald Trump has an enduring base of popular support. It's gone up, it has in fact gone steadily up over time in terms of numbers. And for a lot of liberals, this is really mysterious, right? A lot of liberals look at Trump and think this man is manifestly unfit, right? This man, way back when, he was calling all Mexicans rapists, or he was calling for a ban on all Muslims coming into our country, and he's corrupt and he's a crook. And these days he seems, far worse than that. But still, he has a base of popular support. And so I kind of wanted to have Toby on to talk about that, about what that base of popular support is and where it comes from and what drives it. And to start off, I suppose I want to start with a common answer, right? I believe, what do you call it? The poverty theory?
The poverty narrative, yeah.
The poverty narrative. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the poverty narrative?
Yeah, maybe as like preamble, I think you're exactly right. Many people have a just how is this possible reaction to Trump. And I guess maybe even before I get to that, I do want to say, I think that reaction is valid because I think there's a descriptive component to it and a moral, right? There's a descriptive, which we'll get into, like why are different groups voting for him, what percentages, blah, 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 which we're going to get to. But I think there's also just a moral judgment in that sort of, which is, I feel like people are doing something stupid and dangerous and wrong, and liberals are correct to feel that way, right? Like, I think when people ask, how is this possible that people are voting for Trump? There's a descriptive question. There's also a moral question, which is, am I right to feel like I can morally judge people for doing this? And I think the answer to the sort of implied question is yes. Now, I think out of a desire not to do that moral condemnation, to not say that Americans are making, many tens of millions of Americans are making morally bad decisions for which they are morally blameworthy, people want to create narratives about Trump's victories in 2016 and now again in 2024 that really just don't have a lot intellectually or descriptively going for them. They want to sanitize, I think, the Trump voter because they're uncomfortable with the reality of where we are. And one of those is this idea, as you said, I called it the poverty narrative. You'll find this really across the spectrum from people like Bernie Sanders make use of it on the left, but you also, I was reading a god-awful article by Chris Orende, whatever his name is recently, in the sort of center. Like, people love the idea that this has happened because many Americans are poor, they're desperate, they've been economically left behind and culturally ignored by the front of the class academic smarmy pants liberals who culturally look down on them and don't give them the resources or respect to improve their condition. And they're lashing out, they're frustrated, and yes, maybe they're directing that in the wrong place, but who can blame them? That's the poverty narrative.
No, I think that's right, and I think your point about how it's uncomfortable to recognize certain aspects of Trump's appeal to people is important, and I kind of want to linger on it. In foreign policy, there's sometimes people talk about the mirroring fallacy, where you're trying to predict the actions of some other world leader, and instead of seeing the world from their perspective, you project your own perspective onto them,
Yeah.
right? And you think, well, I'm a good liberal person, and I don't delight in cruelty or hatred. And so if somebody's acting like they do, well, then obviously there have to be some other, more morally laudatory motive, or more understandable, more intelligible motive in there. And that often comes back to economics these days. You called it the poverty narrative. That's often referred to as the economic anxiety theory, right? Which is that Trump's support is driven, like you say, by people who are, they've been torn apart by neoliberal depredations, and they're hungry for something that isn't more neoliberalism from the Democrats. And so naturally they voted for the billionaire.
The jobs
Now,
have gone to China, and now they're racist. It's sort of at its reductio ad absurdum.
That's right. And I think it's worth noting that this theory isn't unique to Trump. There's a book from, I want to say, 2005, What's the Matter with Kansas, that is expressing the exact same puzzlement that we're starting with here. What is the matter with Kansas? They used to be Democratic, and now they're Republican, and it seems like they are voting against their interests. And so this is a question that has kind of bedeviled liberals for 20 years now. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we've seen some of that in Bernie Sanders's pitch, right? The idea that the masses of the United States are just hungry for real working class economic policy, and if we can just deliver promise, Medicare for all, and an enhanced federal minimum wage, and better Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security, or pick your policy here, then that will activate, swarms of voters who have been, feel out of touch with the political process, and they will come over to the Democratic Party side. Personally, I think that this hasn't happened. This has continued to not happen. Bernie Sanders couldn't win the Democratic primary. Democrats have campaigned on enhanced federal minimum wages for years now, and it has not delivered them enormous electoral majorities. So I guess to some extent, you can see the same idea in so-called deliverism in Biden's economic policy, where this deliverism is the name for this idea that you would just deliver economic benefits to people, right? Which Biden did, right? The wages of, the bottom quartile of the income spectrum went up pretty substantially faster than inflation under Biden, far better wage growth, far better employment numbers, and that this would just naturally bring people over to the Democrats. And again, by the numbers, that just didn't happen. And so stepping away from the poverty narrative, or the economic anxiety theory, or the false consciousness theory, all of which I just don't think, like you say, really have a good theoretical basis, that
they're just not especially descriptively true of the world. Make what you will of that, but there's always a bit of interpretation. But there's some narratives that have a lot of facts to back them up, and some that have less. And this, I think, has a lot of appeal to people for some of the reasons you mentioned, but it's not well borne out by facts.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think people are drawn to these theories because they are comforting, because they are comfortable, because they make the world make sense, but they just don't connect with reality. If they connected with reality, then Kamala Harris would be in the White House right now, and she isn't. And so, yeah, this brings us back to several of the the Trump trilogy. And I guess, what's your own pitch? What's your own theory here about what's actually driving the mass of Trump voters?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say there. I think you're exactly right, as just to note something you said earlier about the mirroring theory, that we're looking at a domestic version of that. I think conservatives do this too. I think everyone assumes that even when people disagree, they're processing the world through the same basic frameworks and categories that others are. And we're not, but it's a very natural, reflexive assumption to make. And I think a lot of the confusion does come from that. So what's at the heart of Trumpism? And by the way, you mentioned Trump trilogy. I have a theory that if you make something alliterative, it's more memorable.
I mean,
So
that's just true. So
yeah, so I mean, one way to maybe context this historically is to say that the core of Trump's vote, what they want and what their values are, has been largely stable since the civil rights era. What's changed is the way that that's been expressed through political parties and our political system. But there has been, at the core of Trump, there is a group of voters who you might call those with a Southern identity, who are predominantly but not exclusively in the geographic South. They're elsewhere as well. Their concerns have been bedrock to the Republican Party for some time. At the beginning of the civil rights era, they were in the Democratic Party, and the fact that they've switched over has somewhat obfuscated the fact that their ideology has been quite stable across that time. At the core is a set of interrelated concerns about race, about gender, and about religion. And we can maybe go into any of those individually, but it is a racist worldview grounded in both anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism. It is a worldview that assumes a patriarchal structure for society with men as head of the household and has a hostility to people who, gay, trans, whatever, who might fall outside of that. And it is a religious worldview. It has a particular form of fundamentalist American Protestantism that sees itself as a chosen people whose providentially delivered country has been taken from them and will be restored to them, possibly violently. Trump, in many ways, has offered of the modern era the most direct and unvarnished and uneuphemized appeal to that section of the electorate. And that is the core of his vote. But that wasn't invented by Trump. That was always there as part of American politics. But because of historic reasons that maybe we'll get onto, Trump is now able to directly market himself to them, whereas previous Republican or Democratic politicians might have felt the need to hedge, to euphemize, to dog whistle. He just talks straight to them.
yeah, I guess let's talk a little bit about that historical context, because I think it'll provide some grounding for what's going forward. And you talked a little bit about Southern identity, and that seems really core to it. So I'm going to start the story here, basically with FDR. To understand modern American politics, unsurprisingly, you need to understand the New Deal and how this revolutionizes government, creates a new era of big government that didn't exist before. FDR is able to pass the New Deal and these enormous government programs because he has huge majorities in Congress, right, that back him up. But he's sitting on top of a very unusual coalition. On the one hand, he has Northern Democrats, who are a working class party who really are pushing for these big social programs. And on the other hand, he has Southern Democrats. And far and away, the primary thing Southern Democrats are interested in is maintaining Jim Crow. And so what you see in the New Deal programs is that there are often special carve-outs to make sure that the New Deal isn't going to touch Jim Crow. Right. And so that's why health insurance isn't structured as a universal program in our country, why it's tied to large employers is a way to avoid giving these kinds of health insurance programs to Black sharecroppers in the South. There are other ways in which the new labor protections are designed to avoid touching domestic labor, like Black women and households, or agricultural labor, again, Black sharecroppers, right? And so he's sitting on top of this very unusual political coalition. But, it gets a lot of stuff done. And then something happens to it. I wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so essentially the civil rights era happens. Now, there are antecedents of that. Even someone like Truman is making steps towards civil rights and is risking fracturing that coalition. But this sort of more comes about in the 60s and 70s when you get in reasonably quick succession a number of Supreme Court rulings as well as acts of Congress that really seem to usher in the end of Jim Crow. Now, of course, that's the formal end. the substantive parts of that will drag on some even into the present, right? But I think what's sort of unusual here is the party whose coalition included these, Jim Crow, if you want to be a bit more sort of visceral about it, one-party authoritarian racial hierarchy states. The party whose coalition included them is the one who in many senses took the lead on implementing civil rights. And there's a number of reasons for that that are kind of murky, and maybe we can get into. For one thing, they were just the ones who were in power, so the demands were directed at them. For another, I think there was genuine belief that what was happening in the South wasn't morally acceptable. There's also the international context of both the Cold War and the decolonization period that go into that. So exactly why it ended up being Lyndon Johnson who signs the Civil Rights Bill and not a Republican president, there's kind of a lot that goes into that, but it creates this moment where the national leadership of the Democratic Party has done something that is profoundly unacceptable to, like, one of the core pillars of its support. And into that, Barry Goldwater says, it's a really famous quote, "We need to go hunting where the ducks are." So in other words, if we want to be a Republican Party that is competitive on a national level again, which by and large, with the exception of like Eisenhower, they hadn't been, we need to market ourselves to Democrats in the South who are very disaffected with what has been happening with Democrats nationally. Goldwater loses terribly, but then Nixon and later Reagan find a sort of balance where you can appeal to those voters with just enough plausible deniability that you won't lose liberal Republicans in the North, who, it's their ancestral home since the party of Reagan, for the party of Lincoln, right? And you get a lot of dog whistles, essentially, i.e. you're sort of saying something in a semi-coded way. So you say states' rights, I believe in states' rights, which sounds innocuous enough. States' rights to what? Well, to segregation, right? Law and order, talk about welfare. And, by and large, the Republican Party through this era was fairly open that that's what it was doing. The Democratic Party through this era does the same thing. The Democratic Party is trying to hang on to anti-racists, hang on to black votes that have once enfranchised generally been with that party, while also hanging on to its ability to be competitive in southern states. So even as late as Bill Clinton, you'll get fairly obvious appeals to white southern racism coming from the Democratic Party. And you have this era, which I just think of as the realignment, where both parties are competitive with both racist and anti-racist votes. Because, even into the Clinton era, Clinton was a Southern governor who spoke with a Southern accent and took some Southern states. This was like a generation where fundamental identity groupings were up for grabs electorally. And we think about the political culture that generated as normal. The political culture that generated was a culture, like I say, of dog whistles, a culture where you never quite said what you meant, a culture where everyone talked out of both sides of their mouths, a culture for the same reasons that fetishized bipartisanship and civility. We've come to view that culture as normal because it's what we all grew up in. It's actually weirdly aberrant. It's not normal in democracies that people's fundamental identities divide between parties that way. Normally, fundamental moral and demographic identity lines up with partisan identity. What happens with Trump, to bring the story to the present, is that realignment completes itself. Anyone who is going to be motivated by a racist appeal is now in the Republican Party. Anyone for whom it's an overt deal breaker is now in the Democratic. So there's now no longer any need to obfuscate one's core commitments. And that's what's so counterintuitive about Trump. Trump doesn't create this new reality, he reveals it. He reveals when he starts saying they're all rapists or whatever, that we are now in a reality where you can say that and it won't move the electoral building blocks. But that reality has always been with us and has always been the norm in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's all very insightful. That this realignment process, fundamentally, it takes a long time, right? It starts, like you say, with Goldwater, with the Southern strategy that's pursued by politicians like Richard Nixon, and it just, long into the 90s, you still have like really racist Democratic politicians who are also stalwart Democrats because like they're just super old and they're like relics from another age. So I mean, sorry, Strom Thurmond, but it's true. And we're really reaching the end of that realignment, where it's becoming more and more obvious what each party stands for. There's some caveats here that I do kind of want to mention here, which is that a lot has been made about the 2024 election that Trump increased his showing with minority voters. And that Harris lost a lot of support in that area. And so my view is that it's important to distinguish between what you might call the core of Trump's support and the marginal Trump voters. And in a highly competitive political environment, marginal voters can decide elections, right? I mean, you might not like it, but it is what it is, right? Trump wins by 2 million votes out of more than 150 million cast in the most recent election by the popular vote. And so we can over-focus on the marginal Trump voters who may be moved by all kinds of things, as all these regretful Trump voter stories are showing. But that can also obscure what's going on with far and away his core base of support, which is, like you say, white evangelicals, people with a so-called Southern identity. Does that sound right to you, or do you want to complicate that story?
No, that sounds right. And I think, as with anything, you can complicate and complicate and complicate, right? Like, we are talking about a nation of 320 million. Like, I think we're at the level here of narratives, and we can ask, are the narratives useful? Do they broadly cohere with empirical evidence? Are they internally coherent? Are they useful to us, right? I think the sort of Southern strategy narrative meets those criteria better than, say, the economic anxiety narrative. Now, with that said, is the sort of Southern identity, is that every Trump voter? No, I'm not even, I'd hesitate to put a number on it, but I'm not sure it's more than like 25, 30% of the electorate. It's not it's a big deal, right? And the fact that it's moved from the Democrats to the Republicans is massive. And it's basically the thing you have to understand everything about Republican politics. But even the Southern identity is kind of like a Venn diagram. I defined it in terms of commitments around race, gender, and religion. Those correlate very tightly, but not universally. There's some people who are racists but are not sexists, or vice versa. And then outside of that, there are people who are just sort of along for the ride. There are, I think when we talk about marginal gains, I would still incorporate some of those into that paradigm, because I think one of the things you notice is across groups, young people, Hispanics, whatever, where Trump has made gains, it's with men specifically, right? And I think concerns about gender that are maybe operating on their own terms sort of are operative there as well. I don't think that it's not that there are concerns about the economy. I think that there are. I just wouldn't frame those concerns in the economic anxiety narrative. But yeah, there's 1,000,001 reasons why people supported Trump, and there's some that fit directly into that narrative, that there's some that are kind of peripheral to it. And yeah, then there's some people just do things,
Some people do just do things, it must be said. But I do, aside from that little bit of existential dread, I want to come back to the thing you said about the Venn diagram, the Venn diagram of racism and patriarchy and religion, and kind of push you on it a little bit, because in your telling, it's kind of contingent, right? Like, oh, these are just three different things, and like, they happen to line up sort of tightly in the Southern identity. But that hasn't really, when I look at the world, that's not the world that I see. Where it's like, oh yeah, you can totally be, a raging misogynist, but like racism, totally optional. But when I look at the world, both in America and abroad, these things always seem to go together, right?
They very tightly correlate. Yeah,
that's right. They not like we've been saying, not always, not 100%. It's a really big world out there. There are all kinds of strange people in it, but there is a tight correlation between these commitments to patriarchy, these commitments to racial order, oftentimes these commitments to a kind of religious order, which we can talk about. Why do you think that is? Why do you think these things tend to go together in this kind of conservative worldview?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's coincidental that they correlate, right? Like, it's not just, oh, it just happens that everyone who's a racist is also a sexist. This often gets described in terms of a belief in hierarchy. I use a slightly different phrasing. I think what's core to conservatism, and I'm taking Michael Frieden's phrasing here, is a belief in the extra-human origin of the social order, which is to say that society is not designed, as utopian socialists might have it, or, we are not charting new ground and constructing new things as liberals would have it. When liberals visualize progress, they I think, intuitively or subconsciously or consciously even, visualize like a line on a graph going up. Conservatives visualize it as a return to an underlying order, a return to a mean, a return to what we know works, right? Now, a structure that is not created by us, but is knowable by us, rules that can be broken, but only to our detriment. It's why conservatism, despite the name, is not about conserving existing institutions. Conservatives can be very radical indeed when they feel that those existing institutions have gotten away from this underlying order. Okay, why is that useful in understanding this? Because all three sides of that triangle can be conceptualized as such an underlying order, right? Conservatives, I think, really believe that there is such a thing as a man, there is such a thing as a woman. They are different, they are intrinsically different. That there are different social roles associated with them. And to the extent that modern society is getting away from that with overly feminine men or gay people or whatever, to the extent that we're not fulfilling that, we're only going to harm ourselves and others, right? I'm saying that's right or justifiable. I'm saying that's how they see it. I think a racial hierarchy can work in the same way. I think it's not always expressed in today's language exactly as we need to go back to Jim Crow, but you'll often see heavily racialized categories like thugs or criminals, and the law needs to get people under control. It needs to protect the real citizens. Again, it's an extra-human origin to the social order. And religion is too, as well as being, in religion's case, the source of the extra-human origin in the first place. Religion provides intellectual / emotional account of why the world is not ours to remake as we see fit, but ours to live in accordance with some higher plan. Not every religious person understands the world that way, but that is a way religion can buttress these beliefs. There's also a historical story you can tell about why they tie together, but that's kind of like the conceptual story for why they tie together.
Yeah, so I have my own ideas here, so I'm going to push you a little bit more. Yeah, but you said conservatism is, the belief in an extra-human, origin to the rules of social order, but you could believe all kinds of things, right? That form doesn't entail a particular content to what those rules have to be. But so in some ways, it leaves unexplained this question of why it is that conservatism always seems to include a pretty strong patriarchal component and a pretty strong racial component. And so my own perspective on this is that, rather than thinking about it philosophically, we should think about it economically, and recognize that there is a kind of a social structure that they're talking about. There is a way of understanding human beings in kind of highly biological terms, right? There's like particular ways that we as a species reproduce ourselves that tend to impact social roles in certain ways, that tend to create groups of people that define themselves against other groups of people, and that require, again, in these kind of old, very patriarchal societies, a particular kind of subordination of women to men. And so there's this picture of the world they're all picking up on. And then, the religious justification attaches itself to that. They sort of meet in the middle right? This social organization, finds an ideology that justifies itself, and the ideology helps maintain the form of social organization, and they kind of fit together in a certain way. I don't know what you think about that, though.
Let me work my way through what you said, and if there's stuff I left unaddressed, call my attention back to it. To start with, I think you're right to say that conservatism is more clear on the fact that there is an underlying social order than exactly what the content of that is. I think that's true. I don't think it's a weakness of that as a descriptive account to note that historically conservatism can go all over the place and it can be quite confused, right? I think to which I would say yes. This is one of the reasons I'm not a conservative, right? Is because another extra-human origin of the social order would be like the laws of economics, the laws of the free market. We have to have free trade and all of that, because otherwise, if we violate that, who knows what will come? Well, intellectually, that has nothing to do with religion, like in terms of like a theoretical framework you can justify. And yet, this is the trajectory of conservatism historically. So I think one of the reasons I'm not a conservative is conservatism is descriptively untrue in a way that other ideologies aren't. And I think this isn't, when I say this, people say, oh, but this conservative here, he doesn't believe overtly in an extra human origin of the social framework. That's not the level at which ideology is operative. I'm saying that when liberals think of progress, in the back of their head, subconsciously, it's a line on the graph going up. When conservatives think about it, they're thinking about a return. And the way you detect that is through language. Make America great again. Brexit. Take back control, right? Like, this is all subconscious and hence very woolly to talk about. And I agree that the subconscious underpinnings of conservatism are not particularly principled or coherent. Yes, I agree. I don't think that means that that's not what the underpinnings are. Now, to the story you've told, is there sort of like a biological economy that sort of... I'm not going to try and rephrase your description. I'm going to get it wrong, but yes, I think though I'd also want to emphasize, as well as the continuity, the change, the flux, the variability. There've been all sorts of caste systems historically, since the age of European empires. These have tended to involve ideas around race, but in the ancient world, really didn't as much. Patriarchy writ large, yes, is a constant, but it's been interpreted very radically different ways. There have been very different models of the family, from monogamous to polygamous, to some models of the family have slaves in them, some don't. Descent can be patrilineal or matrilineal. Slave status can be patrilineal or matrilineal. You can have all sorts of different combinations there. We live in a society which is patrilineal, but slave status is matrilineal. Other people have done that the exact opposite way. So I see what you're saying, and your article about the patriarchal bargain, I can see the structure you're deriving out. Yes, I would also want to push how radically, even while people have always insisted on hierarchy and insisted on a certain structure, how radically changeable that's been. I think, yes, it has changed a lot, even in recent history.
I mean, to take a line from you, I mean, this just reveals the way that conservatism can express itself in many different ways, and oftentimes in incoherent ways, or in different ways in different contexts. But we can see a certain underlying structure that they keep on returning to, again, that gets interpreted in many, many complicated ways. I think what I kind of want to emphasize here is the idea, something that I believe in, and I think you seem to be suggesting, is the idea of conservatism as an active force in the human personality, right? That a lot of liberals seem to think, well, there are liberals and there are people who haven't figured out that they're liberals yet.
Yes.
And there is no opposition, there is no other team that we are playing against in the world of politics. And I increasingly don't think that's true. I think there is another team that it has a structure to its ideology, that it has a picture of the world that it's trying to implement. And I guess if I could summarize a lot of what you've written about for us, whether it's about, believing, what Christian Trump supporters say when they talk about their support for Trump, rather than dismissing that as unchristian, well, you have to take them seriously. They believe it. Right. And so to me, we have to take these people to some extent seriously when they talk about what they want, right? When they talk about, oh, we want to have a new racial order, we want to put women back in the kitchen, we want to do all these terrible things to our country. They're not just, they might be confused, but they're not just confused, right? There's a real political force there that we have to reckon with.
They're not just confused liberals or disappointed socialists. Yeah, of course. I think, people believe what they're telling you they believe. I think one of the things, there's not many, but one of the things the sort of new atheists got right was when people are telling you their foundational commitments, they're usually being sincere about them. For someone like Sam Harris, this would be in the context of the Muslim suicide bomber. No, that guy actually believes he's going to get into heaven. And now Sam would then tie that to a whole bunch of domestic politics around immigration and so on that I don't subscribe to. But the insight is true enough. People believe what they're telling you. And I would apply that to conservative Trump voters. Maybe not every Trump voter. Like I say, people do all sorts of stuff for all sorts of reasons. But the core, they're telling you what they want and what they think. And I'm just very skeptical. And my whole project in this Trump trilogy is essentially about it is a negative polemic against some of the narratives we construct to paper over that reality, to sanitize it, and to create liberal justifications for people's behavior that they are not making for themselves.
No, I think that's right. I see this tendency in contemporary politics. I see it in history. When people say, well, they couldn't possibly have believed what they were very explicit about believing, so we need to retcon some other more reasonable justification for what they were doing. And you wind up with these theories where if you listen to what people are saying, then they're saying, well, just all these people, what they were saying was bullshit, and everybody knew it was bullshit, and they all said it anyways, and they all.
But then why were they saying it?
Yeah, exactly. Why were they saying it?
If nobody believed it, then what was the utility of saying it? Exactly. At least someone had to be taken in by it for that to make sense.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it is as uncomfortable as it might be for us personally or for our moral sensibilities, we have to take people at least somewhat seriously when they say what they want. And I guess that's all very depressing. But in closing, I kind of want to ask you maybe a more hopeful question, which is, what do we do about this? Right? I want to try on neoliberalism here to look to the future a little bit. And not just to ask how we got here, but to wonder what we might do about it. So I'll throw it to you. What are we going to do about this?
I don't know. So as a big picture statement, I think, the particular moment that we're in American politics might not admit of a one weird trick to solve Trumpism. I think we're at the intersection of a number of quite serious system level failures. So it's not just the way the electorate is currently aligned, although that certainly is troubling. We're also seeing, a justice system that isn't doing its job. We're seeing a media that's fully acquiescing towards fascists. We're seeing the sort of institutional safeguards like impeachment or the 25th Amendment are now clearly not working anymore. Whatever the hell is going on with men, whatever the hell is going on with social media spaces. And all of these on their own are very significant problems for a liberal society to deal with. But we have to deal with all of them simultaneously while they operate in interlocking and complex and unpredictable ways. So that's my bold, optimistic opening statement there. But I think at the level of belief, we should also think that people see the world very, very, very differently. I think that's like You're quite right. That's the foundational thing I'm like coming back to in these essays again and again and again and again. Like, not everyone is a liberal. People aren't turning, or from the Bernie Sanders perspective, people aren't turning to Trumpism because they didn't get enough socialism out of the Democrats. They never wanted socialism to begin with. They find this project attractive. But at the level of belief, people do change their beliefs. You know, if you look at something like support for gay marriage, I'm not saying there's not homophobia anymore. Of course there is, but that's gone from like 70-30 one way to 70-30 the other quite quickly. We've talked about racism a lot, and while the percentage of overt racists in the population is just way higher than I think most liberals care to imagine, even if you just poll people, like, do you hold racial prejudice? It's like 20% are like, oh yeah, you know, right? Like, it's that sort of a number, but still it's down. Not actually in recent years, unfortunately, racial sentiments have gone up something of an uptick since the 2010s, but it fell rapidly during the 90s. Like something like the question, are you strongly opposed to interracial dating? That had like a solid 70% white support at the start of the Clinton era, more like 20 now, you know? And that's not just generational replacement, that is people changing their minds. But also people change their minds back. It seems like public opinion. It's not just that people get more liberal over time. I think that's a myth. You know, history doesn't have a direction. It's just stuff that happens to us. You know, I think probably on immigration, from what I'm seeing, public opinion has moved rightward quite significantly. I think on gender roles, we've moved rightward quite significantly, maybe in the last 10 to 20 years. But all of which is to say that persuasion is still a game, right? And you know, it's a difficult game and a challenging one and kind of just a weird, chaotic one, because the reasons that people change their mind are all over the shop and they often can't explain them to themselves, let alone anyone else. So I don't have a, here's how you deconvert a Trump person. I think that's an important conversation, something we have to be doing. But the answer is it is going to be different for different Trump people, and depending, you know, we talked about the triangle of race, religion, and gender. I think they go together, but for some people it might be one's really the primary one, and others, you know, another one is. But I don't want to be in stressing that people think very differently. I don't want to say that that's locked in or inevitable. People can and do change their minds. And one of the things actually that drives me so much up the wall with all of these sort of glossing over narratives, and is they never really attempt to persuade people. They say, oh, we have to understand that the working class are frustrated and resentful. Okay, and then what once we've understood? Oh, we have to understand that men can't get laid. Okay, and then what? You know, what do we do after that understanding them? It's always that we need to empathize, never that we need to tell people bluntly that they're getting it wrong. Sorry, that was quite long, but that's how I see the world.
I certainly appreciate all of what you said here. And there's one thing I'm really struck by, right, which is that you said that people's opinions have changed. Right. And I think the gay rights movement, the change in opinion on queer rights generally is kind of enormous, and people seem to forget about it these days. But I remember what it was like to grow up in the 90s, right? And just the absolutely pervasive homophobia from my childhood is hard to really express to people who didn't grow up with it. Just the absolute constant policing of straightness versus queerness, and that if you displayed a little bit of queerness, people would just hurt you, right? And that, I mean, yes, it still happens, right? There's still bullying, but the level of pervasiveness, the level of total social ignorance about what queer meant or what trans meant, that's changed enormously. And it did not change because of federal policy. Mm-hmm. Right? It did not change because the federal government wanted to make a change or because this or that person won an election. It was in large part a result of a concerted social movement on the part of gay, lesbian, queer, trans people to sort of come out and make our case to the world that we're just people, that we're just normal, that there's nothing to be afraid of and it's all fine. And it worked. Right, that movement worked to profoundly change social attitudes. So I think that's very important to remember in these kind of bleak situation that we find ourselves, that people have been in bleak situations before and have successfully changed the narrative.
What we are dealing with here is nothing new. You know, it has a particularly modern flavor and a modern language, but people dealt with worse than this. And I know you had a piece recently on the civil rights movement. They were facing longer odds than we are now. And I think, people are resistant to that thought because, I was so, listen, I am a straight guy, right? Like, and I cannot emphasize for me how profound that high school conditioning of like fucking everything is gay, or like every aspect of your expression is minutely policed under real threat of violence, right? And this is as a guy who's like probably not ultra machismo, but probably more towards the masculine side of things. And like, I felt that as an oppressive, almost like totality, like what being a kid going to high school, even a generation ago. I think the reason people are uncomfortable with that is they hear you were saying, well, everything's all right now, but that is not what I'm saying, and that's not what you're saying, and that's not what that sentence means, right? Like, there's now no longer homophobia. Nobody is saying that. We are saying that minds have changed, and that how total this sort of like masculine paranoia used to be for young men has eased somewhat, and that is a very good thing, And I think, to tie it back to what we were talking to earlier, it does kind of relate to this idea of people mean what they say they mean. Like these things are real and they are operative in our world. And this is, that high school policing of gender is an example of those ideas being operative. People believed that there was something wrong with being a man and not presenting in a certain way. Even having slightly atypical interests, right, could be enough to put you in danger. Right, that is a belief, and in many ways, recognizing that those beliefs are real, that there are still people who feel that way, that is the starting point to doing the persuasion that you talked about. Because if you believe that these are merely disappointed socialists or slightly confused liberals, you're not engaging in that project in a way that is grounded in reality. You're not understanding what it is you have to do. You have to get someone who does believe these things to not believe these things. And I don't have all the answers for how to do that, but let's at least start by understanding what the actual problem that we're needing to address is. And it's interesting that the people who push these narratives never even really seem to try and talk people out of these beliefs. They're just all armchair generaling. What you need to empathize with the working class, or with men, or with this or that or the other. Here's what liberals need to say. Liberals need to understand. Liberals need to validate their fictitious grievances. It's never, here's what I do. Here's how I've talked people out of it. Here's what's useful to me. It's all just, you go do it, you liberals. And I just think that's just a functionally useless way of interacting with the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. Right, that it takes the form of liberals scolding other liberals rather than liberals taking action. Again, I really want to come back to something you said here, is the perspective that history gives you. The recognition that things are bad today. Things are bad and bad things are happening, but you look back 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, things were much, much worse. And people were in our position trying to imagine, what can I do about it? And they went out and they did something about it. And some of them failed. Many of them failed, but some of them succeeded. Some of them changed the world for the better. And I think here on neoliberalism, what I want to do week after week is to try and get that larger historical perspective in order to inform what we might do about it. So, Toby, thanks again for coming on the podcast. And I hope to see you all again next week. As a reminder, Liberal Currents and Neon Liberalism are listener-supported publications. So if you want to support us and join our thriving Discord community, you can go on over to patreon.com/liberalcurrents and pitch in to help us out. So thanks again for listening, and have a nice day.